very much for joining us. So on top of just what's been said, in terms of here at ECPAT in the UK, when we do our training, we use something called Mentimeter. And basically, it's a way to maintain interactivity with the people listening when we are presenting over the internet. So basically, how it would work is I would suggest keeping your computer watching the presentation, and I'd suggest just taking your phone. And if you just go to a browser, so you open Chrome or something, if you type in menti.com, and then once you type that in, you're going to get a screen that looks like this. So it's going to ask you for a code, a number. I've put the code in the chat there. I'll just copy and paste it again. But the code is 5737973. If you type in that code, then you'll basically enter our training, our webinar. And whenever there's an interactive slide, you'll be able to add your comments or opinions on it. And as well as that, at any time, you can ask me a question. So if you would like to use Mentimeter over the next hour or so, then please feel free. If you don't, it doesn't matter. You can just keep using the Zoom chat. So as I've already been introduced, I will go straight into it. So I work for ECPAT. Here in the UK, we focus solely on the issue of child trafficking and exploitation. ECPAT is an international network. So you might be familiar with other ECPATs across the world. There's 110 different organizations worldwide, and we all do slightly different things. But as I said, here in the UK, we focus on all issues relating to child trafficking and modern slavery and exploitation. So as we're getting going then, let's see where we're coming from and who is joining us. So on Mentimeter, if you have logged in using it, then you'll be prompted to answer this question. So where is everyone coming from? I think we have people all over. As you can see, when people submit things, it comes up live on the screen, so we can see everything that people are adding. Okay, so we got a wide variety so far: Croatia, France, and Calais in France, Germany, Hungary, London, Bosnia, good, Greece, Iraq, people coming from all over. You're most welcome today. And then the next question then is what different jobs or professions are people coming from? I know that we often do get a wide experience of practitioners joining for these roles. Okay, great. Loads of different professions coming up here. We've got child protection consultant, legal advisors, students, social workers, program coordinators, GP trainees, psychologists. Great, loads and loads of different experiences here. Please feel free throughout when I'm talking to have your own discussion in the chat. Anything you want to add, anything like that, please feel free to talk amongst yourselves. I'll try and pick up any questions, but I might not see everything that people have added. So we will be using Mentimeter a little bit because it's quite a short webinar. We won't be using it a lot. Usually in our training, we use it lots and lots. But just to introduce us at ECPAT UK, we do various different things. We are quite small. We're London based. The most important part of our work is we work directly with child victims of trafficking here in the UK. And our youth program is central to everything we do. all of the research we do, all of the training we do, all of the campaigns we run is focused on what our young people say. Okay, so our training is designed around what our young people say. When we do training, we have a young person who co-delivers our training. So the practitioners that we're training hear it directly from young people. So those are all the different things that we do. But now we're going to get straight into it. And the first thing we're going to do is I'm just going to give an overview of trafficking in the UK. So just looking at some of the trends, what are the different kinds of trafficking we see? And then the second half of this webinar, I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail on how we respond to trafficking. Okay, good. So if you look at the UK's NRM data, here are the headline facts for it. So this is the data from last year. We had 10,600 referrals into our NRM system. So that's for adults and for children. For any of those who are not familiar, the NRM is the National Referral Mechanism. So it's the way we identify victims of trafficking. Out of those 10,600 people, 43% were children. So we had 4,550 referrals into our NRM. The most recent data that we had a couple of weeks ago, for the first time ever, children are more than 50% of all of our referrals. So you do see increasingly how trafficking in the UK is an issue of child trafficking and child exploitation, not primarily of adults, which is what we had maybe 10 years ago. And then what you see on the bottom right is that 53% increase between the 2018 and 2019. So what's that showing is there's a very, very large amount of increase in referrals coming into our NRM system. So, if it's increasing 50% every year, then, we're getting into a lot larger numbers now. The reason why this is happening is for a couple of reasons. Number one is that there is a much better awareness of trafficking in the UK. Number two is that there's better awareness of the processes. So when I was first a social worker back in 2015, the NRM wasn't particularly well known, even though it had been around for a long time. Now there's a lot better understanding in the UK about these processes, so there's more referrals there. And number three, the other reason why there's been an increase is because in the last few years in the UK, we've been able to improve our understanding of what counts as trafficking. So an example is I used to be a social worker in a youth offending team, and a really key type of trafficking we see in the UK is child criminal exploitation. When I first started that job, we knew that the young people were being exploited, but under our UK law, they were still criminally responsible for their offences. However, during that time when I was practicing, there was a push to get an understanding of child criminal exploitation being a form of trafficking. And now in the UK, this is generally understood that criminal exploitation of children is a form of child trafficking. And that is another reason why we're getting an increase in the number of referrals coming in. And then you can see in the top right corner as well, the gender ratio of our children being referred in. So about 3/4 of the referrals coming in for children are for boys compared to girls. Now, if we break that down and look at the different types of trafficking we see here in the UK, this is a fairly typical breakdown. We have about 50% of all referrals for children into the NRM is for criminal exploitation. So it's by far the most common form of trafficking that we do see here in the UK. And we see multiple different types of criminal exploitation. We see cannabis cultivation and drug production. We see drug supply. We see what we call acquisition offending, so theft, burglary, pickpocketing, that kind of thing. We also see forced sexual offences and various different other forms such as money laundering or fraud. Secondly, the second most common is labour exploitation. So about 1/4 of all children referred into the NRM are experiencing forced labour. We have 16% of all young people referred into the NRM for sexual exploitation. However, what we do see is that sexual exploitation is a form of control for children who are trafficked, and therefore we see sexual exploitation in almost every other form of trafficking we see. So, for example, a young person might be referred in for criminal exploitation, but it's very common that children will also experience sexual violence and sexual exploitation alongside that. And that might not necessarily be recorded by the person referring into the NRM. And then we have a lot lower numbers in terms of young people being trafficked for domestic servitude. It's under 4% at the moment. However, this is a very, very hidden form of trafficking. So we probably think that there's more young people being trafficked in this way that are not being identified. And then we have just over 0.5% of young people are referred in for organ harvesting. Although that is an incredibly low number and it is unusual, the question we're asking at the moment is we have a lot of young people in the UK trafficked through North Africa and the South Mediterranean. And these are areas which we know there is a lot of organ harvesting happening. So at the moment, we're just trying to make sure practitioners are alert to the indicators which suggests that someone may have had their organs harvested on the way to the UK. Okay, good. So just a little bit of other data to get an idea about the breakdown of child trafficking in the UK. This is the data from the National Policing Unit on trafficking. So it's called the Modern Slavery Unit. This is data from February of this year, so it's a little bit out of date. And this gives an indication about the different investigations for trafficking going on here in the UK. So if you look in the middle screen, the middle chart, you see just over 1/3 of all investigations for trafficking is related to forced criminality. We have just under 1/3 of investigations are for labour exploitation, and we have 22% of investigations are for child sexual abuse or exploitation. So again, that gives a bit more of a picture. You get the majority of our trafficking in the UK is either criminal exploitation, forced labour, or child sexual abuse. So this is just another chart from our NRM really, and it just shows a really large increase in recent years. So it was around 2016 that it became much more accepted that child criminal exploitation was a form of trafficking. And in the UK, we have something called county lines exploitation. Basically, what that means is we have a lot of young people who are forced to run drugs up and down the country. And the reason why it was first named county lines is it was these phone lines which were used to run the drugs. And these lines were going across the UK, so across different counties. And this has been one of the things that has increased the referrals into the NRM. But as I said, there has been an improvement in general about child trafficking and what trafficking or exploitation is. And therefore, we have seen that big increase. It's caused quite a lot of problems because there has been such a big increase in the referrals coming in, but there has not been the same increase in the ability of the NRM system to respond to these referrals. So we do see really, really long delays in our NRM. We also are concerned about some of the decision making. If you look 10 years ago, the overwhelming majority of NRM referrals were for adults. But now we've just reached the threshold that more than 50% are for children. And therefore, just thinking about the institutional knowledge in these teams, they might not be that familiar with child safeguarding or for child protection or development. So, there are really quite significant challenges for this. And because of that, ECPAT UK are advocating for what's called a devolved decision-making process for the NRM. So what we mean by that is, instead of the NRM being referred into the central government, we suggest that it should happen on the local level. Here in the UK, almost every safeguarding or child protection issue is done at the local level, and we have these multi-agency teams that make decisions together. Child trafficking is one of the really unusual forms of child protection problems where this doesn't happen. And we say it should happen because every other type of child protection issue is dealt with in this way. It's really only child trafficking which is dealt with quite quickly, quite differently. So we're suggesting that it should be brought in line with other safeguarding practices here in the UK. So to think, where are our young people who are victims of trafficking coming from? So on the left-hand side, you have the top 10 countries of origin for child victims of trafficking. What is often surprising is you'll see number one is the UK. So UK citizens can be classed as child victims of trafficking here. I know that that is different in other countries, and that's not necessarily the same. But again, we've come to recognize that it doesn't actually matter where a child is from. Any child is vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. So therefore, children in the UK who suffer child sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, or criminal exploitation, they are also victims of trafficking. Okay, it's not just young people from abroad. So at the moment, about 50% of the referrals into our NRM are British national children, and then the other 50% come from different parts of the world. What you can see there is that the majority of our young people come from Vietnam, Eritrea, or Albania. Countries like Eritrea, Sudan, and Ethiopia, a few years ago, they were nowhere near the top 10 for child victims of trafficking, and they've increased very, very quickly. So if you see in a few years, Eritrea has gone from not being in the top 10 at all to being the third most likely country of origin for child victims of trafficking, whereas countries such as Vietnam and Albania have been very consistently near the top. What's also on this this slide is 3 countries which are in the top 10 country of origin for adults but not for children, and that's India, China, and Pakistan. And actually, India and China are number 1 and 2, I believe. And what that really suggests is that sometimes we think of children as just miniature adults. They're like adults, they're just younger. But that's not the case at all, okay? And this really shows it, because not only does it work differently, child trafficking and adult trafficking, but it affects different populations of people. So here we've got the most common countries where adult victims of trafficking come from. They're not even in the top 10 for children. So you see that they have fundamentally different dynamics, and it's not just the case of children being smaller or younger versions of adults. It's actually something different in the trafficking dynamics. So someone's just asked about national rather than local processes. I'll talk a little bit about it later when we talk about identification and things. But if you do have any questions after that, then please feel free. Okay, so that was just really an overview of the data when it comes to trafficking in the UK. Is there anything that's surprising to you, or is there anything that is really quite different to where you are? So I'd be really interested to know what's surprising and what's different compared to where you are. Please feel free to share a Mentimeter, or if you want to add it in the chat, please feel free to do so. Okay, so someone's raised that there's many different kinds of trafficking. So yeah, here in the UK, we have quite a broad interpretation of trafficking and modern slavery. I know that some countries, there are different requirements. So in some countries, there has to be someone who is moved. The movement is essential. In other countries, they wouldn't count things like child sexual exploitation as a form of trafficking. So I know it's different, but here in the UK, we do have that quite broad understanding. Yeah, so people have talked about exploitation of begging as a form of child exploitation in Greece. So we do have the same here, but that counts, we actually count that under criminal exploitation. It doesn't quite fit there, but the reason why is because we see the young people who are forced to beg are also the same ones who are exploited for acquisition offending, so theft and pickpocketing and things. So because of that, we kind of do campaign, do sort of put those together. So people have said surprised about the low percentage of domestic servitude. That's right, it is quite low, but again, it's very hidden. So there's plenty of suggestions that we don't recognize all of it, or we don't identify all of it. People are saying they're surprised that the UK is a top country. So yeah, that is often surprising because we do count any British national child who has experienced exploitation is potentially a victim of trafficking. But also, I mean, we obviously have a lot of UK national children in the UK. Non-British children are still disproportionately a lot more vulnerable to trafficking compared to our British national young people. Good, okay. So thanks for adding that. Yeah, so I mean, a few years ago, the whole British nationals thing was very different. You had very, very low numbers or almost no British national children referred into the NRM. What really did increase it is our understanding of child sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation. We have lots of British national children who are sexually abused across the UK and who are criminally exploited across the UK. And you know, it took us some time to get the message out that just because a young person is being trafficked within the country, it's still trafficking, it's still exploitation, and therefore we need to recognize that. Okay, thanks for adding that in. So the next thing I'm going to just talk about is what we do. What are our systems here in the UK? I'm not very familiar with any of the systems from any countries that you guys are joining from. I did used to work in other parts of South Asia in trafficking, but I don't know whether what I'm going to explain to you of how we work it here in the UK is something very new and unusual to you, or it might be something which you also do, but we'll see. So the first thing I'll mention is our legislation and the law. So in 2015, the UK Parliament passed what's called the Modern Slavery Act. And this is the piece of legislation that has all of our laws about trafficking in it. okay? Before this piece of legislation, any of the laws around trafficking were in different pieces of law. Some of it was in the Crime and Disorder Act, some of it was in the Serious Organised Crime legislation, some of it was in the Sexual Offences Act. It was duplicating, so it doubled up. It was contradictory, okay? It contradicted itself, and it was really confusing. But what this act did is it brought all the legislation related to trafficking in one place, okay? Compared to other pieces of legislation around the world, it's quite a good piece of legislation. They were drafting it for about 4 or 5 years. It took a long time to kind of do it. The issue that we have is that it is not implemented enough. Okay, what the Modern Slavery Act does is it outlines the criminal offences for trafficking someone or committing modern slavery offences. It outlines some of the prevention orders that the police and the courts can use to try and stop it happening. It outlines what we call the Section 45 statutory defence. This is really, really important for children because 50% were children, 50% of referrals were for criminal exploitation. What the statutory defence does is it's our non-prosecution principle, okay? And it outlines the defence for a young person who has been a victim of trafficking, and because of their exploitation, they have committed offences. So it's really important for young people being criminally exploited because it offers them protection from convictions and prosecution. It outlines compensation avenues for victims of trafficking. It reinforces the presumption of age for child victims of trafficking. An issue that we have here in the UK is child victims of trafficking are not believed. And in particular, people don't believe they're the age that they say they are. What this piece of legislation does is it reinforces EU legislation that we must believe, well, we should have the principle of the benefit of the doubt, and that we should believe the young person's age. What the Modern Slavery Act does is it outlines what we call the independent child trafficking guardians. So these are guardians who will be appointed to a young person when there are suspected issues in trafficking. It's a really good service. It has been independently evaluated and it's shown to have better outcomes for children. The main issue is that even though this was put in law 5 years ago, it still only covers 1/3 of local authorities in England. So only 1/3 of children in the UK can actually access a guardian. So one of our key campaigns is getting the full rollout of this service because it really does benefit children. It also outlines our NRM system, and we also have an independent anti-slavery commissioner. So this is an office within the government who is independent that overlooks all of the issues when it comes to slavery and trafficking. And it can have quite an important function about getting the government to respond how it should. So we work very closely here at ECPAT UK with the IASC office. So how do we identify child victims of trafficking? How our system works is that whoever identifies a child victim of trafficking should then refer the young person to the local authority. So like the municipal council, the city council. So whoever is the local government body in that area, they will have a children's services, okay? And children's services is responsible for issues or any child protection issues, looked after children by the state. All of these different things are come under the responsibility of a local authority children's services, okay? So almost all social workers in the UK will be employed by a children's services department on the local level. So what should happen is that when a frontline practitioner does suspect trafficking, they should be referring into the local authority children's services. Um, Most of our referrals come from police, home office, or border agency, but almost no, the majority of children who are referred into the NRM will be referred in by social workers. Okay, so it's the primary form of how we identify victims of trafficking. So if we're training teachers or medical staff, what we train to do is if you do suspect trafficking, you have to refer into the local authority, and they are the ones who should be doing the NRM referral, and they are the ones who should be responsible for trying to safeguard the young person in collaboration with the police and other agencies. So yeah, I mean, children's services is really key to the response of child trafficking, trying to safeguard young people, trying to protect young people as well. So question is, what about SOS lines for victims? So yeah, we do have the Modern Slavery Helpline. Anyone can call that. But in terms of the actual support that goes to a young person, it will be through children's services. So for example, if the UK's Modern Slavery Helpline gets a call from a child who has been trafficked, they will facilitate a referral into that child's local authority, because it is the local authority who has the jurisdiction and the power to and the responsibility to safeguard that young person. So once a young person is referred into children's services, we have what's called the Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub, or MASH. What we've learned through mistakes in the UK is that if we are to effectively safeguard children, we need to do it as a multi-agency team. So in MASH hubs in children's services in the UK, there'll be social work, police officers, education staff and medical staff all in the same place. And how it works is that those people are sitting all together, and when a referral comes in, they will do checks on all of the systems, and then they will decide what the response needs to be. So if there needs to be a police response or a social work response or a medical response, they can do that together. What should happen once a young person is referred into children's services is, if they've been trafficked, then the NRM referral should be done. Unaccompanied children in the UK will become looked after children, so the local authority will put them into foster care or a children's home. And after that, what happens is it's that multi-agency network around the child that is where the safeguarding decisions happen. So it's usually the social worker is the primary or the lead professional, and they will coordinate the police and support services. And, you know, if ECPAT are part of that, they'll coordinate ECPAT and all these other agencies working with the young people. And it is in that multi-agency network that we aim to safeguard the young person. So we share information and we coordinate our responses to try and protect young people. Someone's just asked a question about the role of the independent child trafficking guardian. So for unaccompanied young people in the UK, they don't have a legal guardian here. And a guardian is essentially someone who is there to look and focus on the child's best interests, okay, to make sure that all the other agencies are there and responding in the right way. Now, the reason why guardians seem to be quite important for the outcomes of child victims of trafficking is that child trafficking is quite a specialist and complex child protection issue. Me as a social worker, I will have to deal with all sorts of different child protection problems. And if I've never had a child trafficking case before, I would be very unfamiliar about what I should do. So what the independent evaluation has found is that it's quite useful having that child trafficking guardian there, because not only are they support to the child, but they can help professionals who are not specialists in child trafficking to make sure that they're doing the right things and responding in the right ways. We find that guardians are very useful in making sure that different professionals around the young person, for example, is understanding the methods of control that encounter child victims of trafficking. So, all these kinds of things, it's very, very useful for that. In terms of a qualification, there's no sort of accreditation scheme for them. So they get training within the service that they have, but they don't have a statutory safeguarding role like a social worker would, or they don't have a specific qualification and registration like a nurse or a police officer. So that very broadly gives an outline of how we respond here in the UK. Just for the last 5 minutes or so, I'm just going to mention some of the successes and some of the challenges we have in the UK when it comes to child trafficking. I think because of the work that we're doing, we always have a negative spin on where we're going as a country, because we see that children who are trafficked are not always identified, or they don't always have the best outcomes, and we're always advocating for our practice to be better. So I think sometimes we forget the progress that has been made. So there's a few successes or positive things in the UK. I'd say that there's somewhat it's on the government agenda. Okay, people in the government do know that trafficking is an issue, in particular child trafficking, child sexual abuse, and child criminal exploitation has been sort of elevated as one of the government's priorities. And the Modern Slavery Act as a piece of legislation is a really big step forwards in terms of trying to protect child victims of trafficking. What we need is more implementation of that legislation. We have had a lot better identification. Okay, 10 years ago, social workers and other practitioners would not be very familiar with trafficking and how we should respond to it. There has been a lot better improvement throughout all different professions, whether it's police officers, social workers, or teachers or something. There's been an improved understanding of previously unrecognized forms of trafficking. So as I said earlier, even 5 years ago, we didn't really have an understanding that when children are running drugs and dealing drugs up and down the country, we didn't really see that as trafficking. But over time, we've understood that this is exploitation. Children are being harmed and exploited and controlled. And therefore, now it is generally accepted within the UK that criminal exploitation is trafficking. And I think that's a big step forwards as well. So maybe 10, 15 years ago, when the police did a raid on a cannabis farm and they saw a 17-year-old Vietnamese young person there, they would arrest them, charge them, and send them to court. That unfortunately still does sometimes happen here in the UK, but generally there's a much better understanding. So when police do that raid and they come across a 17-year-old Vietnamese boy, they're immediately thinking trafficking instead of thinking that this young person is a perpetrator. So we are getting some improvement there. Because of the other thing as well, which I think is better, is that we're starting to become a little bit more specialist in our teams. So here in the UK now, Children's Services will have unaccompanied asylum seeking children teams, or UASC teams. We also have child exploitation teams. We also have adolescent teams. I think this is a really good step forwards because as a profession, social work has always been generalist. We deal with all these different issues. And what we feel is that these specialist teams hold certain knowledge. They are aware of the issues of trafficking. And because of that, they're working in ways which is a lot more effective. They're able to identify trafficking easier, and they're better at responding to it. So I'd be a bit tentative with this, but generally, I think we are increasing the knowledge base, and we understand how to effectively respond to child trafficking, how we're able to disrupt child trafficking and try and safeguard children. So we are getting an improvement there. Okay, I think a few years ago there wasn't really any research done on it. There weren't very many specialist teams. So I think that's another positive that we've got here in the UK. So besides foster care, are there any other alternative family care structures for unaccompanied children? So no, we basically, unaccompanied children in the UK will either be put in foster care, or they'll be put in a children's care home. And generally, children's care homes are for 16 and 17-year-olds, and they're almost all boys in there. So those are really the two main types of accommodation or care for child victims of trafficking. So what problems do we have here in the UK, and what are the challenges that we have? And these are just a few of them. I could probably go on forever. Number one is the culture of disbelief around child victims of trafficking. It is such a big problem that when children come to the UK, when they talk to professionals, they are not believed. Their story isn't believed. Sometimes their nationality isn't believed. Their age isn't believed. And children get this experience straight away that they are not believed. Okay. And that's a really big issue, because it increases the likelihood that young people will go missing and be re-trafficked. It reduces trust, so it means that we're not getting disclosures about exploitation and trafficking that we should do. So it's a really, really big problem. It is getting better, and it's further along with other agencies than others, but we do generally have this issue with children not being believed. Linking in with that, children not being accepted for their actual age. This is really big in terms of a safeguarding problem, because it means that children are being placed in adult accommodation. It means that children are not getting the entitlements they should. And again, it leads to more things like missing persons episodes and re-trafficking. Here in the UK, I don't know if you're aware of the term, but we have a hostile environment to immigration here. And because of that, it kind of builds in and it links in with that culture of disbelief. We get a lot of young people whose immigration and asylum applications are refused. And often it is refused because of this phrase, adverse credibility findings. Basically, that means that if there is the smallest discrepancy or difference in a young person's account, then their credibility, how believable they are, has been adversely affected. So as soon as there's adverse credibility findings, a young person's NRM or their asylum will be rejected. And what that leads to is very unstable and insecure positions here in the UK. Again, it causes an issue because it increases the likelihood of re-trafficking. The capacity in our NRM is really under strain at the moment, as I mentioned, and that means that although NRM decisions should happen within 45 days, the latest statistics say on average it takes 322 working days. So it should be done in 45 working days. It takes almost 10 times that amount. So pretty much on average, it takes more than a year, okay, if you take into account weekends. Although we do have a lot better practice, we're getting uneven practice and uneven response. So it's sometimes what's referred to as the professional lottery. If a worker is familiar with child trafficking and understands child trafficking, they might respond really well. But if there's a a practitioner who is unfamiliar, then they might not get the same response. So it is uneven, although we are getting generally much better at responding. Linked in with a culture of disbelief, children who are criminally exploited are still being criminalized, they're still being charged, they're still being sent to jail. And the other issue as well, because of the hostile environment, young people from outside the UK, if they get sent to prison for an offence, they will be deported when they leave custody as well. As I've said, linked in with all of these issues, we are getting further exploitation and re-trafficking as well, which we are, it's very difficult to try and manage. When I'm training social workers and other practitioners, it's this issue about how to sever the link between the trafficker and the victim. It's really, really challenging, but we do have some successes there. And as I said, we don't have a nationwide guardianship service there, which is hindering our progress. When you put all of that together, the main problem that we have for young people who are victims of trafficking here in the UK is a lack of durable solutions. Okay, so they don't have a stable future here, and that causes so many difficulties for their welfare and their well-being. So, we can sum it up with the main issue child victims of trafficking do have is a lack of durable solutions. And because of that, they're vulnerable to re-trafficking. So a question was, are children deported after rejection if their asylum application is refused? No. So if it's refused, what we have here in the UK is something called a UASC leave. And that a young person has that until they're 17 and a half. So they will at least have that until they're 17 and a half, unless they're Albanian. What we are starting to see is Albanian children being deported. That is something quite unique to Albanian young people. So yeah, if young people's asylum are refused, then they get what's called UASC leave, which runs out when they're 17 and a half. So are there any surprises in the systems, identifications, anything I've talked about there? Feel free to sort of reflect on any differences or any surprises. But at this point as well, I'll open it up to questions. We've just got a few more minutes. So does anyone have any questions for me that they'd like to ask? Yeah, so question was, do we use translators? Yeah, so interpretation is really important, but it's also quite common practice here in the UK. So yeah, we do use interpretation a lot. There are some challenges with that. When we get outside of London, it can be sometimes really challenging to get interpreters, particularly if you're talking about a young person who is found in a raid or something in the middle of the night and they're in a rural part of the UK. It can be quite difficult to find a Vietnamese or an a Tigrinya translator or something. So yeah, in terms of intercultural facilitators, no, but there is a big emphasis on things like in social work practice, being culturally literate and culturally being able to understand different cultures. But it is a key problem that we do have here. And that's why, the British Red Cross or Refugee Council and different support workers, which that can try and bridge that gap is really important. There's a question about school enrollment. Are there obstacles? Yeah, there are obstacles. It's better. Most of our unaccompanied young people who are identified as victims of trafficking are 16 or 17 years old, which means that it's about college instead of school. It can be difficult getting a young person into college. It depends, but there are different challenges. Young people placed in rural areas find it difficult, being able to travel far to go to college. Again, in certain areas, if a young person struggles with English, then their access to college and English language classes is a lot more limited as well. So the question is, are children provided I think that means psychological support? So yes, it depends, but that would be offered by what we call CAMS, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, or possibly other support services. So we have specialist practitioners who focus on that. Generally, the models are, it varies around people-centered or various different counseling models. A lot of it is around CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but it does kind of depend. But access to child mental health services is a big problem in the UK. It's something quite well known in the UK that our child and adolescent mental health services do not have enough capacity. And because of that, you get very, very long waiting lists. And unfortunately, what it means is that young people rarely get help unless they are in very, very sort of severe have quite severe mental health difficulties. So that is somewhat of a challenge. That's why we very much try and encourage practitioners working with young people to be able to provide some sort of therapeutic support, because I think sometimes we have a compulsion to refer to someone and thinking that they will be able to fix it, and it's not something that I can't fix. So I'm just wondering if there are any other questions before I finish. So questions about female victims of child sexual exploitation. Are there special houses? So yeah, you very rarely ever get a girl who is placed in a semi-independent unit. It varies. We have quite a few secure units here in the UK, which a young person is kept in. They're not allowed to leave. Often, overwhelmingly, it's girls placed in secure units. So most secure or lots of the secure units that girls will be in will be girls only units that do have this specialism working with that. But what we notice is that our child victims of trafficking who are female, they're much more likely to be placed in foster care, whereas our boys are placed in semi-independent accommodation. So that's one of the main differences as well. Just wondering if there's any other questions, and then I've just got a couple of other comments to finish up with. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for those questions. I hope I didn't miss any. I hope I've given good answers. Just a few things before we finish. Number one is our ECPAT training. And actually, because of coronavirus and lockdown, we've moved everything online, and it's actually expanded our horizons a lot. And we quite regularly have practitioners from other parts of the world who decide to join our training. So even in the last couple of months, we've had people from Turkey, Luxembourg, Germany, and Croatia join. So, I'm surprised by this, but people are logging on to our training from other parts of the world. So go to our website if you're interested in joining any of our training. So it's all there. You as an individual can book on and log into our training if you'd like to. Have a look at all of our research as well. Some of it has been very influential outside of the UK as well. In particular, this one, which is Precarious Journeys. This was our research into trafficking from Vietnam over to the UK. And this picked up a lot of interest in other countries which victims of trafficking were transiting through. So in particular, I know that it was picked up by the Dutch Parliament and raised as an issue there as well. So you might be interested in some of our research. But apart from that, if you want to know more about what we do, you can follow us on Twitter. You can sign up to our newsletter as well. But apart from that, you can get in contact with me if you want. So my email address is there. Also on Twitter, I post things which is relevant to child trafficking in the UK. If anyone wants to ask questions or get in contact with me, please feel free to do so. But that's everything I wanted to say today. Thank you for joining. Thank you for asking your questions and listening to me, but I'll hand back over now.
Thank you very much, Phil, for very engaging and interesting webinar you have had today. It was really interesting to hear how the trafficking is dealing with in UK. And thank you for sharing these specific types of trafficking. I believe we have a lot of to learn about how the UK is approaching to trafficking. For me, just two final information. First is if you want to receive a certificate of attending this webinar, like always, you can write to email of the Child Hub. I will write it in the chat. Just a second. Child, okay, just a second. Okay, here it is. And the last one, please give us a few seconds more to give us a feedback of the webinar today. And please stay in touch with the Child Hub. If you didn't like our newsletter, please, you can get it through the Child Hub platform. We are having 4 to 5 webinars per month, so please stay in touch and be with us with new interesting topics that we will have in the future. And thank you again, Phil. Thank you all of you for being with us today. I wish you a very nice rest of the day and the week. Goodbye.